Hey, David Preston.
All right, thank you everybody. I'm really happy to go after Maya today because my project is super related. It's about the transformative potential of community land trusts. I'm going to start off with a land acknowledgement because it's super relevant to this project. We are on Muwekma Ohlone land, and this land holds a history of colonial violence. Muwekma people are still here today. This project is really connected to their fight for the return of their homelands, and it's also connected to the land struggle of Palestine, where people are dying right now as we speak. And I've been holding those people in my heart throughout this project, and I want to bring that grief into the space today. So this project comes from a bigger reckoning that I have with how we as a society relate to land. And we have this system of private property ownership that many people don't question. But the truth is that this system stems from ideas in European Enlightenment about human domination over land. And they created this system of private property rights that says if you have money, you have a right to profit from mixing your labor or somebody else's labor with the land, doing whatever you want with it with no consequences as long as it benefits you. And it's this system that drove violent colonial empires. It gave landowners the right to profit from the enslavement of human beings. It excluded many people from owning and building wealth from land, especially Black people in the US. And today it's giving corporations the right to grab land all over the world and exploit labor and destroy biodiversity, the climate, and ecosystems. Many people have been resisting this system of land ownership for centuries. My project centers on one form of resistance, which is the community land trust. The story of the community land trust starts with a group of Black civil rights activists in the rural South who realized that voting rights mean little for Black people without economic power. And they decided to focus on land as one way of gaining economic power. And here's a little clip that's explaining why.
You can help people fight for their rights, but when they don't have a base, when they don't have something that they own and they get kicked off the property, that's a really, really, really tough position.
There was this growing feeling on the part of so many individuals and leaders within the movement that if you had your own piece of land, you could do things. You wouldn't be dependent on others.
What these activists envisioned was creating an autonomous community of Black farmers who collectively owned their land and on all the resources on it so that they could build wealth from these resources and be independent from the dominant US political system. And the legal mechanism they used to create this was the Community Land Trust, which is a nonprofit organization that purchases land and permanently stewards it for public benefit. They're governed by a community board that develops the land. It can be any type of land. They separate ownership of land and buildings so that residents purchase buildings for more affordable prices and not the land underneath. And then they create leasing agreements with residents to ensure that the land is being used for the benefit of the community and the natural environment. And so there's over 300 community land trusts in the US today and more around the world, and they're actually known mostly for only developing affordable housing. And they do a good job of getting people into home ownership because they make the buildings more affordable for people, but they're not radically solving the housing crisis because it's not deeply affordable. And it's also limiting the creativity and flexibility with which the CLT can be used. They also tend to be today more geographically dispersed. They're purchasing plots of land wherever they can to benefit the most number of people, but this can lose out on social cohesiveness and this strong community identity. And in many cases, this means CLTs are becoming more like businesses, and they're not focused as much on this radical community empowerment. So what I wanted to do is explore community land trusts today that are focused on shifting power into community hands, shifting economic power, political power by promoting community autonomy, and also shifting the relationships with land from domination to reciprocity. So I found and built relationships with a community land trust in the Berkshires, which is a rural farming region of Massachusetts, and also a coalition of community land trusts in New York City. And these CLTs are all supported by a really strong base of grassroots organizing with radical political goals. And they're also purchasing and developing all types of land in their region so that communities can have control of their assets. So I wanted to understand more like what was making this so transformative. My project is a community-based research project, which meant it's really deeply relational. And I co-developed my research question, project plan, and product with these CLTs along the way, and it's actually still in process. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about what makes the CLTs transformative and how they're doing this work. The first transformative impact is building power through an economic base. And so what they're doing here is taking all land in a region and trying to control the assets upon that land. And assets can include housing, it can include farmland or natural resources, industry, commercial space, schools, or community centers. And then it's making sure that the people in the community are owning and building wealth from the assets instead of outside corporations, which controls the development of the community. It's also helping ensure that development is creating living wage jobs, union jobs, worker cooperatives. In New York City, what they're doing is purchasing these underused buildings and turning them into community centers that have all of these really important community resources that didn't exist in the neighborhoods beforehand. And in the Berkshires, I forgot to say this, but they're developing and preserving farmland for small regenerative farmers, and they envision a locally owned regenerative food system in the community. So the second big impact is building autonomy through community-led development processes. What this looks like, people are leading community envisioning processes to plan urban developments they need in the neighborhood. And what this is doing, it's creating a lot of opportunities for people to get involved, which builds social cohesion and empowerment. And it's also making a statement about the fact that people are the experts of what they need in their neighborhoods, and they deserve to be the leaders in decision-making of urban development and urban planning. CLTs are also serving as a base for political organizing, and this is really notable. It's different from normal nonprofit organizing because it's much easier to organize your people when you have an economic base, and people are more motivated to get involved when it directly benefits their livelihoods. And then the last thing that these CLTs are doing is cultures of reciprocity with land and the people. Because they preserve land permanently, they can keep polluting industries out and preserve or enshrine environmental justice in their leasing agreements. They can do projects that restore long-term environmental health and also benefit the health of the people. Some CLTs are also returning land to indigenous people and supporting the restoration of their traditional ecological knowledge systems, which were developed over tens of thousands of years of indigenous people observing and caring for the lands that they were on, which required a long-term relationship and not a profit motive. So these three impacts in some cases can be used to actually support local economic transformation. There's one CLT I worked with in the Bronx that is part of a broader movement to create a system called economic democracy. And what this is taking the major economic resources like land, labor, and capital, and ensuring the institutions that are producing these resources are democratically designed so that the wealth built from this production benefits the community. And the CLT is a part of this movement alongside other cooperative institutions, innovative partnerships, and a people-driven policy plan. So these grassroots movements are up against a lot of challenges. Major wealth inequality, eroding public trust, and also just like a lack of social cohesion. But I would argue that this makes it even more important that we look for creative solutions. Most people don't know about this type of CLT, but I think that means their potential is unexplored, and I wonder what could happen if more people knew about this and we really invested our time and energy and resources into these types of movements. I also looked into future visions for the CLT movement, because I think, one, if governments could change policy so that CLTs were the automatic recipients of underused lands, that could really help them. CLTs could also partner with the government on urban development processes more routinely. Second, I think that CLTs like this would gain more power if funders evaluated their success differently. So instead of focusing on numbers or reports, they could really be in deep relationship to understand the quality of the impact, the relationships being built, and the power being shifted. But this requires a shift in how we evaluate what success means of social initiatives. And then finally, I think we could create a culture of land gifting. So people who have more land they need might give it to their family, or they sell it to another private landowner, or they give it to a conservation land trust. But if they knew about these types of CLTs, they could build a relationship with those CLTs, understand what the community needs, and really try to help the people who are there benefit from the land and get their needs met. I want to end this presentation with the takeaway that I think it's really important to have radical imagination about what is possible. We are in a time where power disparities are greater than ever, and we really need to shift power. And I believe that the people closest to injustice are the ones who have the most creative solutions, and we need to follow their lead. And so, yeah, I hope that you all can sit with that as well. And that's the end of my presentation. Thank you very much.
I'll let you field the question, Sophia.
Yeah.
So, great presentation. My question is, how resilient over time are these CLTs? How resistant are they to change of who's in them and outside pressures?
Yeah, I guess, do you mean resilience more from outside pressures or more from internal change?
Well, like how persistent are they able to keep the vision going over generations of people?
Yeah, so most of the CLTs I looked at in New York City are pretty new, but the one in the Berkshires has been going on for like 50 years, and it grows pretty slowly, but I think that they do a really good job of like strengthening their relationships, and because it's such a small rural town, it's like super relationship driven, and I think that because that drives it, it's more able, like people are really connected to it and really invested in it, and I think that's a really good show of like, I guess, sustainability of it, yeah. Michael?
So my question is almost the flip side of Professor Rosenfeld. So I'm curious, is it possible for a CLT that is maybe formed with a focus on bread and butter issues of affordable housing, is it possible for that CLT to kind of grow into, change, kind of take on these larger issues of economic democracy and empowerment and autonomy over time, or is it something that needs to be sort of baked in from the very beginning? And I ask because there's a new CLT in Mountain View, California that I've been, somewhat involved with or in touch with at least. Literally, it just received its papers to be incorporated as a CLT last week. So it's brand new, and I'm wondering, would you say to them, wait, here's what you need to do right now before you really acquire any land or anything, here's what you need to rethink? Or would you say to them, start slow, get a property, start your, get your people involved, and you can progress over time to take on these larger questions?
I mean, I would never tell a CLT that they should do this. I think it really has to come from people wanting this empowerment for themselves. I think the purpose of this work is just to show that it's possible and that people are already doing that, and that if maybe there's a CLT that's focused on affordable housing and they didn't know that like it could be so much more, and that if there's already this local organizing base that's like, okay, like we want economic democracy, we want ownership of assets and governance, then we could do that with the CLT, and like that these suggestions are like more helpful for that if it's already happening, but I just don't think like I or anybody else should like force this upon any CLT. If they want to do just affordable housing, like they could do that. But yeah, I think this is just important to know it's an option and that these things can be helpful. Mario?
Yeah, awesome presentation, super interesting. I had a question about, so for CLTs that happen somewhere like the Lower East Side, I guess it kind of depends on where the CLT is, but I'm wondering, do these CLTs kind of reflect the demographics of the neighborhood, or do the CLTs kind of skew maybe more wealthy or less wealthy, or more white, less white?
I think it reflects the demographics, at least from everyone I talked to. The CLTs in New York City are all led by Black and brown working class people, and they're rooted in these movements of like fighting harmful economic development and urban planning in New York City and the real estate industry that's been happening for like decades and decades. They're coming out of tenant movements, they're coming out of environmental justice movements, and so I just like, that was super, super prominent, and everyone, I didn't get enough chance to talk about this, but like a big reason why this was so powerful in New York City is because it's like about Black and brown power and self-determination, which is still really not given by people in power in our society today. Yeah. David?
I've always loved your commitment to engaging with radical ideas and assessing their transformative potential. And I wonder, in that line of thinking, whether you think there's any transformative potential in applying a CLT approach to what the nation state should be all about. You might think of it as a vision of the nation state that's somewhat in alignment with the communist vision. But I wonder whether you think that might be a way to reapproach that vision in a new and transformative frame. What do you think?
That's a good question. So I've studied theories of socialism and communism and all that. And what I've read is that like the original ideas of socialism is more rooted in worker power, but that gets eroded when the state controls everything. There's still power disparity, and so that new socialist theories are about building up the power of civic institutions and the social sector. And that still requires government support. I think a lot of them are like, we still need a government, but like if there was actually a civic sector, different from the private sector and the public sector, that had this power, and then the government could like work with them and revert to them on some of these big issues instead of just like the public sector and the private sector doing everything, and oftentimes leaving working class people out of the picture completely and harming them. And so that's things like CLTs could be a part of this civic sector. It's like giving people economic, social, political power so that they can like leverage that against the private and the public sector.
Quick question in from the Zoom. Is there an analog to CLTs from other countries?
What an analog?
In other words, are there CLTs in other
Yeah,
countries?
there is quite a few actually, and I did a whole paper on CLTs in the global south, and those movements are like, they're more actually happening in like these informal, like I guess slum or like habitat, what's a good word for them? Yeah, just like the informal settlements, yes. And that is different because they don't have like legal property rights, but they're creating this like new way of building power with the lack of property rights in the first place, which is